In this video, we'll be discussing the economic effects of a subsidy and whether it actually creates a welfare loss in a society or whether it's an efficient policy. First thing we need to establish is what a subsidy actually is. So pretty simply, a subsidy is a grant that's paid to producers, and this grant is actually going to have the same effects as decreasing the costs of production. So it's in essence, it's enabling domestic firms to compete with imports because they can sell their products at a lower price. So that effect of the decrease in cost of production is going to have the effect of lowering price for domestic producers. Now we can see how this is going to actually play out when we start playing around with our demand and supply model. We can see here that at the point SF, where the price is the world price, we would of course import these products because we have a comparative disadvantage. Now, imports would be the area Q1, Q2. So we can see here, because the world price, or PW, is lower than what the domestic price is, as illustrated by equilibrium, imports equal the area Q1, Q2. Now, what the effects that the subsidy is going to have is really the same as a shift in supply because it represents a decrease in cost. So let's have a look at how this shift in supply will actually work. We'll get our supply curve drawn out to the right, illustrating an increase. And we're going to label this curve SS, or supply with the subsidy. Draw a little arrow there to remember that's the direction that we're heading. So what's happened now is that domestic production is actually increased because domestic firms can now supply more at the same price. So if we go along here and have a look at the increase in domestic production from Q1 to Q3, and really that's the first economic effect of our subsidy. So if we have a look at the effect of this policy of a subsidy, the first effect is that domestic production will actually increase from Q1 to Q3. Now, that's also going to have an impact on imports. Imports will decrease. So imports have actually gone from the area Q1, Q2, and imports have decreased from Q3 to Q2. So the other thing to note at this point is that there's been no change to the amount that consumers pay for imported goods, and there's been no change to the quantity that consumers receive. So we can see that at this point, really, there's been no adverse direct effects on consumers. Now that word direct is really important because whilst there are no direct effects on consumers, there is some indirect burden, right? There is some indirect burden placed on consumers through the opportunity cost of taxation revenue and where else that could be spent maybe in a more efficient means. And there's also impacts on resource allocation because inefficient producers are actually rewarded through no real innovation of their own. Now, we can show these effects using the demand and supply model and having a play around with producer surplus and consumer surplus. Now, in order to illustrate what the cost of this subsidy is, we need to establish that producers are paying a lower price than they would have without any change or any grant paid to them at this quantity Q3. So the price that producers would have received to justify supplying at this point can be shown by drawing a line up from Q3 to the original supply curve, SD, and then going across to the price axes. Now you can see that this price is significantly higher than the price that they're currently charging. So without that subsidy, they would not have actually been able to supply this good and be able to compete with imports as a result. Now, to illustrate the effects of the cost of the subsidy and producer surplus, we're going to label this area. Now, we're going to label this area A, point B, point C, and then point D up here. Now, the cost of the subsidy can also be measured by looking at the price times quantity of the subsidy. Now, the cost of the subsidy, I was going to call this COS down here. The cost of the subsidy is area DAWB. Okay, so it's that rectangle in that point where between the price that producers would have received without the subsidy and the price that they're actually receiving due to the government benefit. Now, obviously, producer surplus has increased because they are producing a higher quantity of this good and they're receiving a higher price thanks to the subsidy. So the increase in producer surplus, the increase in PS, can be measured by the area DACW. Now, there's quite clearly a difference between these two areas. I'm just going to make this W a little bit clearer. DACW. There is a clear difference between these two areas, and we can see here that the cost of the subsidy is actually greater than the increase in producer surplus. Now, the reason for that is because there is some inefficiency in this area, and that area is ABC, all right? So this is the deadweight loss that's created. Deadweight loss, which is the area ABC, which is a little triangle between the cost of the subsidy and the increase in producer surplus, all right? So this actually creates, therefore, a net welfare loss because of the fact that the cost of the subsidy is greater than the increase in producer surplus. Now, the reason why this creates inefficiency is we need to remember that the subsidy is paid out of taxation revenue. Now, this money could have potentially been spent in other areas on the economy, other goods and services such as education or health. So this probably isn't the actual best, most efficient way to spend this money, because really what we're doing is we're creating an artificial advantage. I've spelt that wrong. Artificial advantage. Now, this actually contrasts to the concept of comparative advantage, which we understand as why countries trade. This artificial advantage has given an incentive for producers to increase their supply without any real cost advantages, without any real innovations. So this is not a sustainable policy in the long term. And depending on your views, tax revenue could be spent in much more productive means as a result. The final effect of this subsidy is looking at this decrease in imports, and we can see why this would be beneficial to a domestic government. It gives them something to really pat themselves on the back with and reward domestic producers by decreasing the amount of imports that we receive. However, again, this is actually inefficient. There's a reason why economically we do import goods, is because we're not efficient in producing those goods. So the government rewarding, again, these inefficient producers in the long run will have adverse effects on consumers, because once this protection policy is removed, indeed if it is removed, then consumers are going to be forced to pay higher prices for that product.